All right. Hi, everyone. So I want to talk today about hiring engineers. And we have just a little bit of time, so I want to tell a story. But just first off, why I think I'm qualified to talk about this. Who am I? These are a few small people who live in my house. But really what I want to talk about is why I think I'm qualified to talk about this topic, which is hiring engineers, but it's also about just hiring people in general. And Extreme Labs was something that we built in Toronto. And Alex talked about how it went from 10 people to 350. But what was most instructive about that was not only how we hired, but the speed at which we were hiring folks. But there was a lot of different things we did that I think Silicon Valley took a note of. And in particular, at Extreme, over 2009 to 2013, we probably hired almost 1,000 people in Toronto. So in a 4-year period, which I think is quite significant. And what's interesting about it wasn't just only a very single-focused team. It was a very diverse team. We had about 35% women. We had about 25% female engineers. So there's something interesting going on there. And I think that if you look at kind of a couple examples of the metrics, we would go to Waterloo and hire 65 engineers in one round and beat out Facebook and Twitter and Google. And one term we actually had 25 candidates that we had hired, and we had 100% acceptance, meaning that every candidate we hired who had an offer at Twitter or Apple or Square or Yelp or Amazon came to Extreme. So there's something going on. And I want to explain this by telling just one story. I have a lot of stories, but just one about a time I went to a career fair at University of Toronto. And for those of you who know the career fair scene, right, you get a little booth, and you got to set it up. And I was there with this guy named Leroy Mascarenas. Some people maybe know Leroy. And we get to the booth, and I see all these other companies setting up their booths, right? They've got the TV screen of what they do. They've got their T-shirts and flyers and big paraphernalia. And I look at Leroy. I'm like, where's our stuff? And he's like, what stuff? I'm like, don't we have booth stuff? Don't we even have like a name? He's like, no, I didn't bring anything. And so we had this empty booth. And so I said, OK, well, we're mobile. Let's just put our phones on the table and start talking to people. And so people started coming up, and they're like, what do you guys do? And we're like, we're Extreme Labs, and we build mobile apps. We work with Facebook and Twitter and Uber and Slack and the NFL and the NBA, and you should come work there. And people said, cool. How do I apply? I said, well, do you have 10 minutes? And they're like, what do you mean? I said, well, why don't I just give you a quick thinking exercise, a little problem. Why don't you think about it and come back and talk to me? I said, OK. And so some people, of course, said, great. And they went away, and some people didn't come back. Some people said, I'm not interested in doing that. And then some people said, you know what, that's interesting to me. I'm going to go away, and I'm going to think about this. And they came back, and sometimes they wrote code, right, because it was a programming problem, algorithm problem. Sometimes they just walked me through the answer that they had. And I would actually ask them questions. What about this scenario, and how do you think about this constraint, and what do you think about that? And they're like, this is interesting, and here's my response. And then I would say something very shocking to them. I would say, you're hired. And people would be like, what do you mean I'm hired? I'm like, you're hired. Talk to Leroy. Well, I talk to this next person. And then I would talk to the next person. And then I would talk to the next person. And it was very interesting because I was hiring people. And at the end of the day of the career fair, I saw all these booths kind of closing up, and these companies would come up to me, and they would, now the companies were not rivals anymore, right? Everybody's closing the booths. We weren't competing. And they would come over and they'd say, hey, how did everything go? You didn't have a booth and didn't have your T-shirts. And I was like, oh, how did it go for you? How did it go with everybody here? And they're like, oh, I gave away 50 T-shirts. I'm like, cool. What about you? We got 100 resumes. What about you? And we got, all our flyers are distributed. I'm like, awesome. What about you guys? And I'm like, oh, we hired 7 people. And you see the shock on this person's face. And you know what the person said? Actually, instead of internalizing that, they said, well, we have this very strict interview process where only 1% of the candidates get from this funnel here to this thing. And I'm like, but what was the goal, right? And the goal for us was to hire people. And so we hired them at the event. And so what's interesting about that, I think, is 3 things that I think we want to take away from that story. And we have many, many different, all kinds of crazy stories of things that we did. The thing that was interesting were 3 things. 1, speed. I really just wanted to meet people that were smart, do a little mini inner idiot test, basically, and then hire them. And what was interesting about it was people in their minds were taking the speed at which I was working and using that as a proxy for how the company runs. So they were saying, wow, if you can hire this fast, I wonder how fast the rest of the company moves. So that was a proxy. The second thing is that interviews are a horrible predictor of performance. So guess what? I didn't do them. Instead of actually spending 7 or 8 hours on interviews, I actually compressed it into 15 minutes and then said, I'm going to spend that 7 or 8 hours in the job. So in the 30, 60, 90 days when that person starts, that's when I get my hours, my 7 hours of work through that person. And then the last thing was, it was a distributed decision-making process, right? In most companies, you have this hiring manager and committee and comp committee, right? Not one person asked me about salary. They actually said, that's great, I start Monday. I hired 7 people, they all started Monday, not asking about salary. I made all the decisions, I didn't have to go to a hiring committee. So the thinking behind that idea is that when you have these proxies, so I had, speed, interview's not a good predictor, and I didn't have to go to anybody else, they felt that the company must move very, very quickly, and then they translated that to our business. Questions? That is a real picture, by the way.
Hi there. Question here.
Where am I looking?
Oh,
here.
Do I have to stand up? I was just wondering how you came up with this method or model for hiring people, and did you regret having that approach after you met with those 7 people on the job?
Yeah, good question. So we had actually after the 90 days, we only had about 1% attrition. So we did a very, very good job hiring a lot of folks in that model, right, after 90 days, not before 90 days. How did I come up with it? I don't think there was a master plan, right? We were just trying things. Literally, I met people and I'm like, this person's smart. Why don't I hire them and see? Right? Instead of saying, why don't I spend 7 or 8 hours? Like I spent a lot of time with companies and like, let's do top grading, let's do this and let's do that. I interviewed at Amazon, it was 8 hours of interviews. They had 8 hours tell them nothing about how good I am. Right? Instead, if they spend a little bit of time, some sort of baseline, hired me and then watched in 90 days, that's a very good indication. Right? Internships are a very, very good interview. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Wow,
Hi.
There you go.
Thanks. So you mentioned that you had a low attrition rate with these people that you hired on in
Right.
this model, and also that interviews are a bad predictor for success.
Right.
What are the measurements like for your model? Along things like company culture and stuff like that people are usually really looking for in interviews.
Yeah, we had not to say extremely extreme culture, but we did have a very cultish-like culture, which I think is a good model for people to follow. I don't know, I find maybe a controversial statement, but I find when people hang out after work, I see a lot of relationships coming out of work. I think that's usually a good thing for the culture. And what we saw is, not only with the extreme amount of tightness between the employees, we saw a lot of people go on to do other great things and stay very connected to us. So we have an alumni group that people come back to. We had an alumni party the other day. So I think there's a lot of good, interesting things that come out of having a culture that's that tight-knit. And it didn't change the environment by bringing in lots of people and then not everybody would make it through the 90 days. That's how your company should operate anyway. And so we just spent a lot of time on that versus I think companies will say, let's do all this interviewing and then we're good. And then somebody's there for the past 90 days and they're not really a fit. So that's what we did. Last question? Oh, sure. Nope.
It's a 2-parter.
Okay.
What was the time frame between 10 to 350? You said?
09 to 2013.
4 years. Okay. How did you finance that rapid growth?
So we were a services company. So we were financing with clients, and we also did take investment from a notable Silicon Valley billionaire in 2012. Name drop, Chamath. Cool. All right. Thank you very much.